In this video, we will be practicing how to hand sew a full backstitch. In order to do that, you need a few tools: needles, thread, a needle threader, scissors, and our backstitch template. Now, in the previous videos for both the running stitch and the basting stitch, I demonstrated using a double strand of thread. For this video, for the full backstitch, I want to demonstrate using a single strand of thread. So for the single strand of thread, after we thread the needle, we want to create a long and a short end. We'll tie our knot at the long end. And to start, you want to make sure that your short end is 3 to 4 inches shorter than your longer end. You don't want your short strand to be too short, because then it will slip easily through the eye of the needle. And as I make my full back stitches, I will adjust the length of the short strand of thread. Now, I have been busy working my full back stitch on one of my backstitch templates, and it looks like this. I've created 6 rows of the full back stitch, and I left my last row using the markings incomplete so that I can demonstrate that now. So using my needle, we're going to start by forming an anchor stitch to anchor our back stitch and make sure that it's a secure stitch that will not come loose. So to make my anchor stitch, I'm going to insert the needle under the bottom of the work at the second marking from the right. Now I'm working my full back stitch from right to left because I'm right-handed, but if you're left-handed, you're going to work this stitch from left to right. Now to create my anchor stitches, which I'm going to make 3 anchor stitches, I'm going to go back into the first marking and come out through the second 3 times. So through the first and up through the second marking like that, and then pull through. That's number 1. 2 more times. That's 2. And that's 3. So that's my anchor stitch. So now that our anchor stitch is in place, we're going to begin our back stitching by entering in through that where the first marking would have been. Now it's covered by our anchor stitch. And we're going to come up through our next available marking. Notice there's a space in between here, and that's what we're going to go back and fill in using the back stitch. So going back to my anchor stitch, I'm going to go in and then come out through my next marking. And now I've created my first back stitch. Going back to the stitch I just made to our next marking and pull through, creating the back stitch. It's called the back stitch because the needle goes into the fabric behind the thread of the previous stitch. So this is why it's called the back stitch. And I'm going to continue with this pattern all the way down to the end of the row. Back to my previous stitch and up through my next marking. Now the back stitch is one of the strongest, most adjustable, and permanent stitches that you can do by hand. The primary function of the backstitch is to join seams that require both strength and elasticity. That means it has a little stretch to it. If you're working on a knitted fabric, you need some give and some stretch. If you notice, the full backstitch looks a lot like machine stitching that you complete using a sewing machine. So therefore, it's very useful when you are repairing seams that have been done by a machine. You can go right in with this full backstitch and make the repair, and it's going to look a lot like that machine stitch. So I'm continuing with the same pattern, and I will keep working this backstitch all the way to the end of the row. As I'm approaching the end of my row, I'm noticing that my short strand of thread is too short. So I'm going to just gently pull on my needle to shorten it and continue. As I'm working the backstitch towards the end of the row, I'm going to finish the backstitch by creating another anchor stitch, which is also a way to finish your stitch without having to knot it. So if you're working that, after I made my last backstitch, I'm going to create 2 more back stitches right over my final backstitch. 1, 2. So now I finished. I can cut this strand, and it's no need to make a knot because that is securely in place. The full backstitch can also be completed using a double strand of thread. So I have my knot tied at the end of both strands. To start, we're going to make our anchor stitches. Going back to the first dot and coming through the second. 1, 2, 3. So we have our anchor stitch in place. Now we're going to go back through the first and up through our third dot, which is our next available dot, and take that full back stitch all the way to our anchor stitch and beginning at the next available dot. We're going to come through, making our first back stitch and continuing on in the same way all the way to the end of the row. So I've been working my full back stitch, and I'm not quite to the end of the row, but I'm running out of thread. So what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and finish where I am using an anchor stitch. So just like we started, I'm going to go back to my previous stitch and create 3 anchor stitches. 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to clip the string And using my next strand, I'm going to pick up again using another anchor stitch. So I'll start where I left off, and create an anchor. One, two, three. With my anchor stitch in place, this knot that I started with, I can go ahead and clip that. And I'll continue on with my back stitch. Going back to my next dot. And I'll keep going. Now this should take me all the way to the end of the row. Now that I've made it to the end of the row, I'm going to finish this row up using an anchor stitch. So I'll go back, make my last back stitch, and sew 2 more back stitches right over my last one. 1, 2, and I'm all done. So now I have 7 rows of my back stitch that I had completed using the template, and I'm going to work 3 more rows of my full back stitch without the template. So starting in the same way, I'm going to create an anchor stitch. One, 2, 3. And now I'm going to work my back stitch freehand using the same method that we did using the templates, going back to my stitch and pulling through, going back to my stitch and pulling through. Now I'm going to keep going to the end of the row, and I'll come back to show you the final product. So I've completed my 10 rows of the full back stitch. 7 of those rows I used the template, and my last 3 I used without the template. When the back stitch is done correctly, it should really resemble a machine stitch, and it can vary between 1/8 of an inch and 1/16 of an inch, which is about half of what we practiced using the template. And from the back, you can see where we have gone back over each of our stitches. This is from the back of the work. So when you're all done, you should have a finished product that looks something like this.